Ear-shattering explosion, and I felt a blow on my knee, which felt like a sledgehammer, and it knocked my knee on one side, and I fell to the deck. And I was lying there, and suddenly somebody grasped the rucksack and pulled me on my feet and said, "You all right, lad?" And it was Major Copeland. He said, "Bumble, lad, at port side. Don't hang about here, it's decidedly unhealthy."
Tibbets and Gough were there, and they were holding these scaling ladders, and these two chaps were laughing and swearing and so on. And I think we probably dropped maybe even 8 feet down onto the dock.
The next thing was Germans, and they said, "Handy hoch," and I said, "Handy hoch to you."
While Tiger was having a set to with Jerry, the demolition teams were on their way to their targets. One of the main targets was this underground bunker, because down there, and I'm not absolutely certain how I actually get down there, but anyway, down there are the pumps that were used for emptying all the water out of the dock. Stairs. The job of smashing this place up was given to a team of 4 commandos led by Lieutenant Stuart Chant. Chant, a stockbroker in peacetime, had to place the explosives even though on the way to the pump house he'd been wounded in the left leg, the right arm and both hands. Unfortunately, the explosives had been pre-rigged in England with very short fuses. So Chant sent his men back up to the surface in relative safety, knowing that when he lit the fuses, he'd have just 90 seconds to climb 7 flights of stairs and find his way through this maze of aerial walkways in the pitch black, because there was no light down here then, while pretty badly wounded. He was a brave man. Chant made it. And the pumping house was gone. And meanwhile, other teams were having similar successes with the winding houses at both ends of the dock.
I went up to my colonel and saluted him and said, "So we've blown up the northern winding house." And he said, "Well done, old boy." So I said, "I'm now ready to go back to England, sir."
At 2:30 in the morning, the surviving commandos came here, where they'd arranged to meet the small boats that would take them home. They were pleased as punch with the way things had gone. But the elation was short-lived, because the scene that greeted them out in the estuary was truly horrific. Almost all of the wooden MLs with their exposed fuel tanks had been blown to smithereens. According to witnesses, the whole estuary was on fire.
Chaps were drowning, there were pools of burning fuel on the water. You had to kick with your feet like mad to try and steer the raft away from the flames, and it was an absolute inferno.
There was a sort of sea of black. You could see sort of sinking boats and hear shouts coming from the river and so on. And then very quickly, the colonel said,
It was obvious that there was no transport home. So he said,
"Right, we'll fight our way out of the town and we'll
split up into small groups and make our way severally across the Spanish border."
I thought, that's a bit of a tall order.
Spain was a daunting 350 miles away. But even before they could set off, they'd have to fight their way out of Nazaire itself. So that's 5,000 Germans who by this stage were awake, alert and organised, against fewer than 120 Brits, half of whom were wounded.
If you're street fighting, you must secure any crossing.
Tiger Watson came round this corner, found himself face to face with a German sniper.
Ran forward, saw him lean forward, pressed the trigger of my Thompson submachine gun, and typically Watson, the magazine was empty. Click, click. Unfortunately, his magazine wasn't empty, and his shot broke my arm and bowled me over.
A party of Germans ran up to him, and one of them actually used the cliched expression, "For you, the war is over."
And I thought, well, I shall have to, escape eventually, but don't feel quite up to it at the moment.
I knew, I was almost certain I'd be killed because there was a watch point, a tower, and I had to go past it. The Germans must have seen me, and I knew they'd fire, and they did, but they hit me in the back and the arm and the leg.
Chance, the stockbroker who'd blown up the pumping house, made it to this point when a machine gun bullet fired from the top of the U-boat pens over there took his knee joint out. He was no longer able to walk, so he was captured as well. The commandos realised that they were trapped on an island and that the only way off it and into the town was across this bridge, which was guarded by what must have seemed like half the German army. By the time they got here, there were only 80 of them left, but plainly they still had some fighting spirit left because they just formed themselves into a sort of great big mass and charged.
Captain Roy now led the assault across the bridge. Streams of bullets hitting those girders, ricocheting off the roadway. Machine guns, pom-poms, rifles. It was like a damn good November the 5th, only more so.
Bit by bit, the commando numbers were whittled down until the remaining men, low on ammo, went to ground in the town. Corin Purden ended up in a cellar.
We suddenly heard all this shouting outside, and then the door burst open, and there were Germans standing there with their coal scuttle helmets and their weapons, looking terribly tense. Frankly, if I'd been there, I'd have chucked a couple of hand grenades down and finished us off, but they didn't. And the colonel, who had his pipe in his mouth, just sort of walked up the steps and said, well, we've done what we came to do, that's that.
As dawn broke, the battle was pretty much over. Just 5 of the landing party would eventually make it to Spain and freedom, and 222 would escape the horror on the few remaining wooden boats. Of the 600 or so men who'd come to France the previous evening, 214 had been taken prisoner, and 168 were dead. And worse still, it was now 7 a.m., 3 hours after the bomb in Campbelltown's nose was supposed to have gone off.
After we were washed ashore, we were put in the back of the lorry, driven into the town, and we were in this big room, and the Germans brought in a sailor. They fished out of the river and put him on the table and said, you try and revive him. We tried to get the water out of his lungs, and by this time we were saying to one another, the Campbelltown hasn't gone up.
The British could only console themselves that despite the failure, they had at least fought like lions.
They were patting us on the back now, the Germans were amazing. Yes, they probably couldn't believe it, that anybody would venture up into a submarine base heavily defended.
Some of the stories of bravery were incredible. Out in the estuary, one of the surviving MLs had gone head-to-head with a much more powerful German destroyer. The British gunner, a commando called Sergeant Tom Durran, was asked to surrender on a number of occasions, but even though he'd been shot 16 times, he kept on firing, until he was overcome by the loss of blood and passed out. But the story doesn't end there, because the captain of the German destroyer was so impressed by Durrant's bravery that when he landed, he took the trouble to find the most senior British officer and said, look, I don't know